Welcome to the final webinar for 2020 of Creative Solutions for a New World Climate and Artists Series, Season 2. I'm Frances Littman, your host, and today we have an incredibly full program with lots of fabulous guests that we look forward to introducing you to. First, I'd like to gratefully acknowledge the Coast Salish people of this region and First Nations worldwide. For thousands of years, the abundance that these lands and waters provide us to live, work, and play is due to the ecological wisdom, stewardship, and reciprocal relationships the Coast Salish and the world's first peoples have lived and live today. We have much to learn. With this, I'd like to share a First Nations-inspired daily blessing, which I have set some of my images to bring us together in gratitude. Greetings and thanks for each other as people. To the earth, Mother of all, greetings and thanks. To all the waters, waterfalls and rain, rivers and oceans, greetings and thanks. To all the fish and aquatic life, greetings and thanks. The grains and greens, beans and berries, as one, we send thanks to food plants. Medicine herbs of the world and their keepers, greetings and thanks. To all animals and their teachings, greetings and thanks. The trees for shelter, shade, fruit, and beauty, greetings and thanks. To all birds, large and small, and the flowers and bees, greetings and thanks. And from the four directions, the four winds, thank you for purifying the air we breathe and giving us strength. The thunderers, our grandfathers in the sky, we hear your voices, greetings and thanks. And now the sun, the light of a new day, and all the fires of life, greetings and thanks. And to the oldest grandmother, the moon, leader of women all over the world, and the stars, greetings and thanks. And to our teachers from all times, reminding of us how to live in harmony, greetings and thanks. And for all the gifts of creation, and for all the love and beauty around us, greetings and thanks. And for that which is forgotten, we remember, and we end our words, and now our minds are one. Greetings and thanks. Take a deep breath and take that one in. And I'd also like to give thanks to some of our First Nations wisdom keepers who we've had on our programs this year, including Geraldine Matson, Patrick Calley, Dallas Smith, Michael Miltenberger, Gordon Plains, and Nathan Matthew. Jonathan O'Riordan, our valued community partner, will introduce our guests today. John is a former Deputy Minister of the Environment. He brings his years of experience to this series while keeping the legacy of his late wife, Gail O'Riordan, a beloved music teacher and professional cellist, alive. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you, Frances, and thank you for that wonderful introductions and your gorgeous pictures. So where do we go from here? Before I introduce our guests, I'd like to make a few comments on how Creatively United and Climate and the Arts are going to address this question. I do this from past experience. I know that when I cede the floor to my brother Tim, I can never get a word in edgewise. So I thought I would start right now. Three areas that we're going to be exploring next year. The first is the role of Indigenous peoples. Frances has already paid homage to them and their wisdom that they've given us over the last year. But we're fortunate in BC and in Canada that both levels of government have adopted the UN principles and the Declaration of Rights for Indigenous Peoples. And this will have a profound effect on climate policy as we move forward next year, because we are going to shift to shared decision-making, genuine collaboration, and informed consent. We will track this journey next year and be include Indigenous leaders in our arts and climate stories as we proceed over the whole full year. The second area is restoring nature's health. Carbon neutrality not only is a reduction in carbon emissions, but also requires increase in storage of natural systems. There will have to be profound changes to the natural resource policy and planning in BC and elsewhere in the world to restore damaged ecosystems, change agricultural practices, husband our soils for carbon capture, implement nature-based approach to managing our forests, and managing our watersheds to provide clean water and make them more resilient to increased threats of fires, floods, droughts, and pests. So we will be tracking policies and procedures in this area. And then the third area is engaging with communities. None of the policy changes will be effective without direct involvement and participation by affected communities. So we'll be tracking how we engage communities and learn from their examples that Tim and John Pennell will be giving us from Norfolk later today. And we will include some of their thinking in our programs for next year. The theme of this webinar is centered on climate neutrality as being a central element in dealing with the climate crisis. So we're going to start the commentary on how US and Canada are tackling climate neutrality. Our first guest is Mace Rosenstein, who many of you will know has given us such insight to the US election and its aftermath. Mace is a lawyer who now spends part of his time in Canmore, Alberta, as a keen student of US policy and the Constitution. And he will discuss with Bob Sandford the prospects of a Biden administration successfully achieving carbon neutrality. Bob Sandford is the Global Futures Chair in Water and Climate Security at the United Nations University and an expert in water policy. So over to you, Bob and Mace, to talk about US policy.
Well, thank you very much, John. And as you suggest, we'd like to begin today's summary webinar with a brief update on the US political situation. So we've invited lawyer and political analyst Mace Rosenstein back to give us an addendum to his November 4th webinar. Welcome back, Mace.
Thanks, Bob. Hello, everyone.
So let's begin by reviewing the status of the US election results. Will Joe Biden actually take office on January 20th, Mace?
He will, but I think we should anticipate, and we've discussed this, that Trump and the Republican Party will continue their efforts to delegitimize and demonize Biden for the next 4 years. They're effectively, in my view, setting up Trump as a president in exile, leading his nation of about 75 million people from Mar-a-Lago, evidently. Some anonymous administration sources said last week that Trump may announce his 2024 presidential candidacy at the same time that Biden is taking the oath of office on January 20th.
So in our previous discussions, we discussed a theoretical scenario in which President Trump could deliberately wreak havoc between the election and the inauguration day on January 20th, or as one Republican Party official said last week, that Trump could set so many fires it will be hard for Biden's administration to put them all out. So focusing on environmental issues for the moment, what evidence do you see of that strategy?
I think we're seeing plenty. It seems pretty clear that before he leaves office, Trump will continue to blow up as much as possible of what's left of America's environmental protection regime. We could think of it as a sort of coda to the nearly 100 environmental regulations that Trump repealed or weakened over the last 4 years. Let me give you just a few examples. These are all initiatives that have been targeted to be completed before Biden takes office on January 20. First, as you probably read, the sale of oil leases on more than 1.5 million acres of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, rule changes to allow road construction, logging, and commercial development across nearly 200 million acres of national forest lands without any environmental review, rule changes to relax allowable levels of lead and copper in American drinking water, rule changes to relax permitting requirements under the Clean Water Act for oil and gas pipelines and surface coal mining, rule changes to weaken protections under the Endangered Species Act. And as to Paris, we should note that even if the US returns to the Paris Accord, as President-elect Biden has pledged to do on January 20th, Trump's policies over the last 4 years, I think, will cause the United States to miss its commitment to lower its carbon emissions by 2025.
So what do we know so far about the Biden administration's environmental policies, and how do you assess his capacity to move them forward?
Well, first, Bob, the good news is that Biden regards climate change as an existential threat. He has said he will embed climate policy not just in traditional environmental agencies, but in all cabinet departments. And to this, witness his appointment yesterday of John Kerry as a cabinet-level climate envoy. I think that's very significant. Substantively, his $2 trillion climate platform, which takes from but does not completely endorse the Green New Deal, proposes to put the United States on a path to achieve net zero emissions economy-wide by no later than 2050. It's a complex and lengthy plan. We can run over a few of its key elements. First, carbon neutral power sector by 2035, commercialization of clean energy technologies, electrification of the US vehicle fleet, a program that was endorsed yesterday by the CEO of General Motors, zero emissions public transit options in more than 250 American cities, remediation of abandoned wells and mines, an infrastructure program focused on green spaces, water systems, and electricity grids, and environmental upgrades for existing buildings and the construction of new sustainable ones. And again, significantly, Biden has pledged that environmental justice will be a key consideration in all of these initiatives. Now, as to politics, if the Democrats take control of the Senate by winning both Georgia runoff elections on January 5th, I think, Bob, the Biden presidency could be transformational from the perspective of climate action. The bad news in all this is that if the Republicans hold the Senate, then I think all bets are off. Republicans say in public that they want bipartisan legislation, but if they control the Senate, any legislation would need the support of Mitch McConnell, who will be a majority leader and who has a long history of opposition to any federal action on climate. The realpolitik is that Biden would need to pick off at least 2 Republican senators in order to get to 50 votes and then to 51 through the vice president. So we may get to see whether Biden's strength as a builder of bipartisan consensus is a match for McConnell's obstructionism. So that in the Sullivan nut is it.
And we'll certainly stay tuned on that because there's lots of implications for Canada and our efforts to achieve the same type of carbon reductions. So thank you very much, Mason.
Sure.
So Bob, over to you, because we're now going to talk about Canada's carbon neutral policy. So I have 3 questions for you. Do you feel optimistic that Canada can achieve the goal of carbon neutrality? Secondly, what would have to be done to achieve this goal? And thirdly, what are the risks if we don't achieve this goal? Over to you, Bob.
Well, you've asked a lot of important questions all at once, but I will do my best. The answers to your questions reside in 2 domains, the domain of science and the domain of governance structures in Canada. So let's start with the science. At present, our planet is doubly afflicted. We have become the most dominant and most dangerous species on Earth, and we have only one serious competitor. And that one happens to have been around for more than 2.5 billion years before the appearance of multicellular life, and that's the virus. But for vaccines, it could still win. But that's not our only problem. Presently, we're doubly infected globally. Not only is the virus killing us, we have made the planet sick with fever. That planetary fever is no longer just causing us headaches. Planetary temperatures are so high and rising so fast they threaten the fundamental function of the biogeochemistry that permits human presence on Earth. So let's begin with the known climate and related risks that a high planetary fever poses now and will pose in the future. In other words, so let's look at what's backed up behind the COVID dam and what is waiting for us as we wait for a vaccine against the virus to be perfected and distributed. The first thing that awaits us behind the COVID dam is the effect of warming atmospheric temperatures on how much water the global atmosphere can transport. More water vapor in the atmosphere is making storms more powerful, heat waves more intense, and drought deeper and more persistent. The rate and manner in which water moves through the global hydrologic cycle is also accelerating. Warming atmospheric temperatures have caused a cascade of impacts, including rapid Arctic warming, disappearing sea ice, changes in the jet stream behavior, and destabilization of the global climate, all of which are beginning to take a big toll. And we're already seeing the mounting economic costs of that destabilization in Canada. It's now estimated that the total index cost to this country of damage caused by extreme weather events from Confederation in 1867 to the year 2000, a period of 133 years, was about $1 billion. The cost of weather damage from 2000 to 2020, that is to say the last 2 decades, was $32 billion. We continue year after year to tempt fate with respect to global climate disruption. We have yet, for example, come to fully appreciate the link between rising planetary fever and food production. We know, however, what food shortages do. They incite involuntary human migration. When food production decreases in the face of lost hydrologic stability, it isn't long before you lose social and political stability as well. And that's what's happening, but we haven't seen anything yet. The United Nations expects there will be 200 million refugees globally by 2050. And there's already growing involuntary climate-related human migration, even on this continent. The habitable zone in the United States is already shrinking northward toward Canada. Much of South Florida, the Carolinas, the American West and Southwest are projected to soon be barely habitable, certainly at certain times of the year. And where will these people go? Well, many of them will want to come to Canada. This movement northward will occur globally. So they're coming, so we should get ready. COVID is bad and it's going to get worse, but hopefully there will soon be a vaccine. Climate change and its symptoms will also get worse, and there is an interim vaccine for climate change too, but to have it work, we have to take it, and there are a lot of anti-vaxxers who don't want to and many who won't. So you asked John if there has been enough done to make carbon neutrality a reality. Well, there has been some preliminary testing of carbon neutrality as a vaccine already, and one of these tests was accidental. Earth overshoot is the date each year when humanity will have used all of the biological resources that the Earth can renew during the entire year. And 50 years ago, the planet could sustain our population and provide for its needs for just over the year. In 2017, Earth Overshoot Day, however, fell on August 2nd, and that year it was calculated that we needed the equivalent of 1.7 Earths to sustain our population at current levels of need and demand. And look like we're on our way to plundering ourselves out of house and home. But this year, something very different happened. Earth Overshoot Day this year fell on August 22nd, more than 3 weeks later than it did in 2019. And the later date reflects the 9.3% reduction in humanity's ecological footprint from January 1st to Earth Overshoot Day compared to the same period last year. Now, this, of course, is a direct consequence of the unfortunate, painful, and completely unplanned economic and other costs associated with coronavirus-induced lockdowns around the world. But even that painful reduction is not enough. Carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere continue to rise despite our unplanned and abrupt reductions in carbon emissions. And this suggests that feedbacks have been initiated that will result in increases in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere unless we're able to get ahead of rising global temperatures now. And one such feedback has been identified right here in Canada, and that is the greenhouse release feedback caused by permafrost thaw in our Arctic. And in Canada alone, there are an estimated 1,500 billion tons of carbon sequestered in Arctic permafrost. There are 1,000 billion tons in near surface sediments, which is about the same amount of carbon that we now have floating in our ever hotter atmosphere. And if we let that much carbon loose, then the climate will go out of control. Because of unprecedented warming in the past 2 decades, the staggering scale of permafrost thaw has turned the Arctic into a carbon source instead of a carbon sink. As one scientist put it, because of permafrost thaw, the Arctic has become an enormous carbon chimney. And though you can't see it, the carbon chimneys that thawing permafrost have created have in effect industrialized the Arctic. The same amount of carbon is escaping unseen into the atmosphere as would escape from some industrial parks in southern cities. So by way of global warming, we have turned the tundra into the equivalent of a planetary internal combustion engine. And the only way this problem has a hope of being addressed is if the 8 Arctic countries can press for full Russian, American, and Canadian cooperation to address the climate threat in time to halt catastrophic permafrost thaw and to prevent runaway global heating. And that cooperation doesn't yet exist. As it happens, however, art is playing a role in bringing Russia and Canada together on the permafrost thaw issue. Gennady Ivanov, who participated in 2 of the webinars in this series, recently held an exhibition in London, England at its Russian embassy. And the exhibition brought Russian and Canadian diplomats into the same sphere over the climate change threat, especially as it relates to the potential for runaway methane releases brought about by permafrost thaw. So we live in hope. Unfortunately, we still have a long way to go, even in Canada, to fully understand the threat. In direct response to the latest science, which was put forward in a webinar organized by the University of Toronto's Massey College, Canada's Minister of the Environment said that he acknowledged that Canada has the largest store of carbon in all of nature, and the federal government has responsibility here. So if carbon neutrality is to climate change as vaccine is to the pandemic, how well are we doing with the development of a climate vaccine? Well, on a federal level, not so good. The Liberals' recently announced climate emergency plan does not have any penalties for failing to meet targets. It's voluntary, which means it's largely meaningless. The federal climate action plan does not come into effect until 2023, with the first report on progress in 2025. When we can't even get the provinces to get on board with any climate plan, let alone a Liberal plan, tell me really, what do you think the chances are that we'll be on top of the climate problem by 2030 and be totally carbon neutral, as the Americans are promising to do by 2050? So federally, all we seem to have done is kick the can down the road. And what they have offered is an absence of political accountability and an admission that cooperative federalism isn't working in this country because the provinces have the option always to do whatever is in their immediate interest rather than what's good for the country or for the world. So what are the consequences of this? Former Yukon Premier Tony Pennicott offered a response to the federal environment minister's Massey College remarks on the government's responsibility to deal with the global climate threat. Pennicott pointed out that if permafrost thaw continues to occur even at current rates, the national goals for carbon emissions reductions will continue to be moving targets. Because of permafrost thaw and other feedback releases, Canada's stated goal of exceeding our 2030 emissions reduction target and net zero emissions by 2050 will recede continually beyond our grasp. Stated bluntly, we are at, or perhaps past, the climate tipping point beyond which the option of carbon neutrality is no longer available to Canadians. So where do we go from here? Well, you can't defeat a global disease with local responses, but if there are enough appropriate local responses, you can slow and moderate its local effects until a global vaccine is available and universally distributed. And I think that's what this webinar is about. So back to you, John.
Thank you, Bob. Very insightful. So it's clear there's going to be a tug of war in the States between the Republicans and the Democrats in our provinces and the national government. So where do we go from here? What about the role of local governments? What can they do to help achieve carbon neutrality? So we thought we would get some international experience in this answering this question. We asked 2 experts who are working with parish councils in Norfolk, England, and undertaking an ambitious project to achieve carbon neutrality within these councils by 2045. John Pannell is the chair of the Wellbeing Initiative for the Norfolk Association of Local Parish Councils, and is encouraging every citizen to reduce its carbon footprint by 1 tonne by 21, which is when the UN conference takes place. Tim O'Riordan is a professor emeritus of the University of East Anglia. He is awarded the OBE for his research in global environmental policy. He's a deputy lieutenant of the County of Norfolk and was the Sheriff of Norwich in 2010. He is also a member of the British Academy. So welcome, John and Tim, and let's hear what you have to say about the role of parishes. And maybe you can let us know what parish councils are, because I don't think too many people in Canada have heard about parish councils in Norfolk. Thank you.
Thank you, John. This puts us on the map. It's a nation of 4 countries, and I live in a county called Norfolk, which comprises about 1% of the UK population. It's divided into 525 parishes, and this map shows you what it is. Each of those parishes covers an area of land. Now, government in the UK is not too different from government anywhere. We have a central government, you have a federal government, but we have devolved assemblies. But then under that, we have local government tiers, regional with mayoralties, a very French thing that, metropolitan, county, or unitary. By metropolitan, we mean cities and places like that. And then below that, we have a much smaller unit, the district borough, usually about 1/4 to 500,000 people. And then below that, parish and town councils, local councils. I think you call them municipalities, that side of the Atlantic. And I just keeping showing you some slides of pictures of England. We can only combat this impending catastrophe, and we've heard earlier just how bad it is, by if everyone plays their part. It's not a matter of leaving it to the government, it's got to happen by everybody. Local councils have the duty to look after the people in their patch, and most importantly, the place in which they live, including making sure it's fit for future use by generations down the road. I'm very concerned that my grandchildren, their successors and so on, will not have a place to live. And so we, Norfolk Association of Local Councils, work at this level to encourage and help all communities do all sorts of things, but particularly with well-being, which includes action on climate change. And so we started last year with this major initiative, and we are thundering along. The picture on the top right is my local church. Below is a local town hall, and below that is the meeting room in the town hall, quite a small patch, built nearly 150 years ago. Now, the Wellbeing Initiative is designed to be inclusive. We include everybody. Race, color, creed, doesn't matter, particularly the disadvantaged, and puts it mostly in emphasis on people who for some reason are isolated from the rest of their communities. But it's about community. It's about people, the place, happiness, and working with lots of partners. We strongly believe that we will only move forward if we all work together. Now, our parishes, some are large, some are small. Smallest, I think, is about 200. Tim, Professor Tim, happens to be in charge of a very small parish. Some are very rural, some are semi-urban, some are on the coast, some have lots of facilities and resources, some have none. We have to deal with all of those and bring them all along together. Now, what we believe firmly is that we will only get together doing this by bringing help to everybody. So this is a map of the way we are moving forward. We are talking at one level, our level, at the centre, Norfolk ALC, with all the major organisations, government departments, MPs, big business, very important, voluntary organisations, police, diocesan and faith groups of many kinds, the University of East Anglia, a big centre of help. The SLCC is the Society of Local Council Clerks, equivalent to the Municipal Council Clerk organisation, of which I'm also a member, by the way. And then we provide services. We've got a national confederation of associations who talk directly and lobby on our behalf to government and national organisations. And then we try to channel all of this back to the 525 parishes who we hope will, at their local level, also be communicating with all the organisations in their village, of which one of the most important is farming. The farmers actually make up about 98% of the land in our parishes. And of course, out of that comes our food and the potential for huge carbon sequestration. So a big achievement, and we've stitched a lot of that together, and it's working like a dream at the moment. We want to reach net zero in every parish. And so we've set a target. Now, this isn't just an individual. This is the totality of the parish to reach net zero by 2045. We tried to bring it forward by 5 years because we know, like an archer, that if you aim at the target, you'll miss it. You need to aim higher, or in this case, lower. And we always talk in terms of carbon dioxide, CO2 equivalents, not necessarily just CO2, because there are some very noxious gases which cause a lot more problems than CO2. So we asked them to add up all the CO2 outputs of every household, organization, business, including farms in the parish. Add back also the imported embedded CO2e in imports, because we in the rich world have outsourced our manufacturing to China, Bangladesh, India, and the Far East, and then pompously berated them for producing more carbon than we do. And some of our figures in reduction have actually been produced by us exporting our CO2 producing industries overseas, which is not a good thing. So we ask everybody to add that back. Then we subtract that from that, the mitigations such as carbon sequestration, solar panels, windmills, and so on. Now, farmland is of vital importance because modern agriculture removes a lot of the organic matter from the soil. A plough doesn't work too well in soils that are rich in humus. And so over the years, many millions of tons of CO2 have been released from soils, which with proper farm management can put it back in there to sequester it. So farming is a very important part. Then we have to subtract from that total also the goods we export, whatever they might be, and the sum of those is the net zero. We've got to get to zero carbon for every parish. Now, on the right, top right, is a lovely village where my grandmother comes from. It's called Walsingham. It's about 12 miles inland from the coast, and it's a very good picture of the village. The thing at the bottom is a shrine to the Lady of Walsingham, and many pilgrims go there every year. But that was inundated in the 53 floods. And my grandmother's house, which is right in the middle, was flooded, so she had to retreat upstairs. That village, 10 miles inland, is seriously at risk now. And it's because we are a coastal community. Down at the bottom, I thought you'd like to see what we had. It's good old-fashioned wind turbine, but very old-fashioned and not terribly efficient. But it did mill good corn. Now, we've got joined up with a couple of really ethical, commercial partners to help us in this fight. One is called Geeky Zero. And if there's one thing tonight I would like to encourage you all to do, it is to look at Geeky Zero. You can Google it, find it, and look at it. It's the most marvelous thing for helping people along the road, individuals, farmers, businesses, everything, to see where they're spending their carbon and where they can make savings. And it isn't just a one shot. It tries to make contact with people and help them, and by giving little token prizes and encouraging them to move their carbon footprint to a much smaller size. Now, it understands that a house will have a changing carbon footprint over time as family changes, that each individual within a family will have a different carbon footprint. So the husband goes off to work in a great big SUV, has a cup of expensive coffee on the way, lunch out, comes back home, whereas his wife generally takes off in a smaller car, perhaps an electric one, takes sandwiches in a thermos flask with food in it. So we need to know what the footprints are, and we need to get the children involved, the young people involved, because they are the movers and shakers in this world, not us old people around here. To do that, we also have teamed up with a company called Good Energy, which is an ethical electricity and gas supplier in the United Kingdom. And it is the greenest we could find. It produces all its own energy, green energy, and all its own green gas, which is most unusual. So we teamed up a holy triumvirate to try and move this whole thing forward to get everybody involved. Now, this is just a few things to think about, and some of this has been touched on elsewhere. We're not just concerned about gas in the atmosphere. We're seeing the depletion of freshwater resources, unprecedented biodiversity loss, ocean acidification, overfishing, pollution, deforestation, and the spread of invasive species. They're all serious problems. And very slightly, it was mentioned earlier, tipping point. One of those tips the wrong way completely and look at the oxygen in the ocean and think one small thing could jolt that into such an extreme loss of oxygen that we wouldn't get anything more out of the ocean. And I recommend that you think seriously about tipping points, but this is very low key. You may say this is a very strange slide to put up. Well, let's look at the risks. If you're driving a car and a wasp enters the window, you'll be taking immediate action to get rid of that wasp in case it stings you, even though the sting is not going to be terribly hard. It's not going to hurt a lot. There is a case where somebody trying to swat a wasp crashed the car straight into a tree, killed all 4 big human beings in the car. So the wasp can have a disproportionate effect. So it's quite a good model for where we're trying to go. But as you can see, it doesn't cause a lot of damage across the world. But a wasp can punch well above its weight, and that's what we've got to do as people in local communities. We've got to start punching above our weight. I looked up the figures on COVID-19, and it's caused 12,000 deaths in Canada. It's just about 11,685 when I just looked a moment ago. Less than 1.5 million worldwide. It's tiny. It's tiny. It's probably less than have died from air pollution, actually. And over on the right-hand side is a little graph that shows that the people at risk are the people my age and above. The young people, the breeding population, the important doers in the world are not much at risk from COVID. And we're spending a huge amount of resource and time fighting what is admittedly a problem, a nasty problem, but it is not an existential threat. And climate change is an existential threat to the whole of the human race. And there you can see in that little map at the bottom just how much it is affecting people in the southern hemisphere. And we've heard how it is going to affect us in the northern hemisphere as these disastrous effects take place in Antarctica and in the Arctic, with the loss of permafrost, with the loss of water, with the loss of ice cover to reflect sunlight back. We are at a very dangerous point in humanity's history. And I really think we must consider that the only people who will act on this are us, individuals, small, local organizations doing their bit, one by one across the world. If we can do that, we can be the wasps that actually do it. Because central government is not geared up to these micro actions. They're very good at macro stuff, great stuff passed down from on high, great wallops of money put into things. But at the end of the day, it's the action of every man, woman, and child on this planet that is going to save the human race from this very, very substantial existential threat. Thank you for listening. And of course, I'm very happy to answer any questions.
Wow. Thank you so much for your enlightened commentary and relevant information. Now, I'd like to introduce you to three powerful youth activists talking about the future generations, the people that are going to inherit this planet, and how are we going to be good ancestors in getting them there. I'd like to tell you a little bit more about them. Mackenzie Cumming is a 15-year-old and resides in Calgary, Alberta. And despite having only formally joined the climate movement in February of 2020, she's been advocating for climate change and climate action, social justice since elementary school. She's a youth organizer with Fridays for Future Calgary and a Climate Strike Canada participant. Katya Bannister is a 17-year-old youth climate activist and community organizer from Thetis Island, BC, on the unceded territory of the Coast Salish and the Hul'qulam speaking people. She leads the Cowichan Valley Earth's Guardians crew and organizes with the Vote 16 BC campaign and works with the BC Youth Council. And Natalie is a 14-year-old activist with the Sunrise Movement, Extinction Rebellion youth, and volunteers with Greenpeace International. And Natalie lives in North Carolina. Welcome. Thank you to all of you for taking your time out of your school day to share a youth perspective. So I'd love to just start with the question, what's next for the youth climate activists, especially after the recent elections of the Premier of BC and the President of the United States? How do you guys feel about that?
So the United States, we just recently had an election. It was definitely, as Sunrise Movement calls it, it's the election of our lifetimes. We have a candidate who is willing to act on climate change and a candidate that was the exact opposite. So the environmental movement, especially in the US, Sunrise Movement made millions of calls to 18 to 24-year-olds across the country, especially in swing states, to get them out and vote.
I think that the results of the recent elections are a reminder to us of how far we have come, but also how far we do have yet to go. With the new BC NDP majority government, we have lost a bit of that green NDP accountability. And I really liked that part of our government. And I think it's powerful to have that accountability in a minority government. But no matter what the results across borders around the world, here in BC, no matter what happens, youth will keep fighting for action and keep fighting for that accountability. And we will keep stepping up and speaking up because our ability to do so is not dependent on who is in office.
Good, well said, thank you. And so how do you as youth feel the results of these elections will impact your community organizing at the grassroots level? Like, are people more fired up, charged up, want to support you? Where are you at with that?
So in the United States, polls have shown that most US Americans want the government in the US to invest in green energy and renewables and start that transition. And so I think it's really telling that the US we now have a climate candidate who has a plan on climate change and has appointed someone special on climate. And I think that, this is definitely going to impact community organizing, but community organizing, if anything, is going to get bigger, I think, in the United States, especially in terms of social justice movements. And the environmental movement in the US has been standing with a lot of social justice movements to demand that we not only get climate related action, but we get social justice. And I think, if anything, community organizing will just keep increasing for people just fighting for climate action and fighting against systematic inequality.
I think there's a concern amongst some that people assume that this is like the end goal was to have Joe Biden elected. But I find that, I don't know, those people are few and far between. And I think that youth organizing and all organizing, grassroots organizing, is really just going to get bigger from here.
That's very hopeful. And so how, moving forward, do youth organizers and activists hope to influence policy? And is there some way that the Creatively United community can help?
I'd like to speak to that. So here in BC, I am, among other youth in our province, am hoping to influence policy with the Vote 16 BC campaign as we work to lower the voting age to 16 in British Columbia. The BC Greens are in support of our campaign, and it is part of their platform. And the BC NDP have a mandate for lowering the voting age after it was passed at a resolution was passed at the 2019 BC NDP convention, but as of yet, they are ignoring that mandate. Having young voters in BC elections will help ensure that the issues that have greatest impacts on young people will be represented in the legislature. So that's climate policy, that's old growth logging, and that's long-term government debt related to climate destruction. Those are just some of the issues. And so what Creatively United can do to support that is to keep elevating youth voices and to keep hosting webinars that invite youth and highlight our work with your platforms, draw attention to the work that we're doing and help to grow those circles of support. Be our supporters.
And we will, believe me. And I was so disappointed. I know how much you wanted to vote, Katya. You were just raring to vote. And as you said in your Instagram post, John Horgan stole your right to vote. And I know that really upset a lot of youth who are really looking forward to that. Anyone else want to add to that question or the answer, or shall I move on?
I was just going to say that. Go ahead.
It is apparent in the US, Gen Z and millennials in the US support climate legislation like the Green New Deal by an over 30% margin, which is a lot. And it's apparent, and politicians know that the younger generations want climate-related action. So you have movements like the Sunrise Movement that are phone banking for candidates that support climate legislation like the Green New Deal and are 100% people funded. They will represent us. And I know Sunrise has elected, I believe, 3/4 of the candidates they endorsed this year, either into Senate or into House of Representatives. Some of the big ones, including Ed Markey's re-election campaign against Joe Kennedy, candidates like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, candidates like that. And we have called over 10 million people in the last 6 months. And I think that, we youth are really showing that we want climate legislation. So much more now that you can't ignore it, because we are going to be there and we're going to pressure you until you have to do something. And it's very, very apparent in the way that these movements internationally are electing candidates into power.
Wow, you have a wealth of knowledge there, Natalie. I'm so impressed. It'd be great to see more youth get interested in politics, and I think they have to. I mean, it is your future after all. So I'm sure you're like these kind of talks are really inspiring. So Mackenzie, did you want to say anything to that?
Yeah, I was going to say, kind of from the What Next is the school strike youth kind of uprising of sorts. It's not just symbolic anymore. We've got very specific demands. And I know both in the US, but also the BC election, obviously groups like Sunrise or Sustainability Teams, we're directly endorsing candidates because we're not going to, we're going to be specific with what we want, and we're going to get involved. Maybe we are still a nonpartisan where we only support policies, but if those candidates are carrying those policies, then we will endorse those candidates and directly support them in government.
Way to go. Yeah, great. So unlike the COVID-19, there is no assured vaccine for solving the climate crisis. The closest way we may be able to come to that is that we become potentially carbon neutral by 2050. I mean, that's the goal. Are you optimistic that Canada can attain this goal?
I'd like to speak to that. At our current trajectory, I'm not entirely optimistic. With the newly proposed Canadian climate targets, Trudeau is being fairly consistent with his climate inactions in the way that they are his lack of climate actions throughout his entire time as being our Prime Minister. He is promising something that is not good enough while still being unable to meet old goals that were not good enough without a real plan to move forward. But whatever Trudeau does, whatever any politicians do, I will be here. We will be here. We will be speaking up and we will be demanding action because we are committed to holding our governments accountable and because we really don't have another choice.
I'm really convinced that the change is going to come as soon as we can get everyone voting. The younger people I know consistently vote for a greener future. So what do you feel like local communities can do to help make carbon neutrality a reality? Is there any suggestions?
I mean, I'd like to speak to that. I think it's going to be different community to community. I know I'm in Alberta, which is like the heart of oil country, where maybe I'm not going to say we're going to ease into it, but if we focus on things that are perhaps less, I'm going to say less controversial to begin with, that might be able to ease people into it, and people will go, great, we like this, let's continue, and keep them pushing harder. Whereas it might be different for Katia or Natalie based off where they live. So I think it's got to be local. Like, I feel like it has to be like local community specific on where we're going to start. And the end goal obviously is to divest completely from fossil fuels and such. But I think you got to pick where you start and make sure that that matches the values of your community to make sure that everyone's on board, your politicians are on board, and then you can go full steam ahead into everything.
Excellent. And any suggestions? Oh, Natalie, did you want to add to that? Or are you okay?
Yeah, I always go back to a campaign that a lady in North Carolina named Deandra Salvador started, and now she's a state senator in North Carolina. She just got elected, but she started a campaign. Low-income communities can spend up to 50% of their living wage, the wage that they have, on energy bills, which when you think about it is insane. And so her campaign provides renewables, solar panels to low-income communities so that they can pay less energy bills and invest that money into maybe, saving for colleges, saving for education, or saving for just basic necessities. And so I think, kind of going back to what Mackenzie said, I think that, a lot of people get very nervous when they hear, when we talk in terms of like money. I know that's a big thing with the Green New Deal, why people don't support that, is you talk about how much money it'll cost and it scares people. And I think that you need to realize that ultimately this is going to cost money. We know that, but we need to realize, would we rather spend the money now, have a green future, or will we rather not and spend the money cleaning up oil spills or, having relief for horrible natural disasters? So I think it's really just talking with members of your community and really just talking about climate action and getting their opinion. And the more you talk to people, whether it's a negative or positive impact, they will still be actively listening.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. There's a really great comment here from Christine Calla, who says, our youth leaders go beyond just voting. They are actively involved in our democracy. A working democracy takes work. If we're not working at it, it is not working. The three youth leaders clearly get this. Amazing leaders. I've never been so optimistic as of now in seeing these three youth leaders. Thank you. So I just wanted to share that with you. And thank you so much for taking time out of your school day to be here with us. We're going to keep on doing this and keep hearing your voices. And now, I'm going to just jump over to you, Dr. Timothy Reardon. Would you like to share some closing comments with us now?
Thank you, Frances, and good morning, all of you, those of you on the West Coast, and whatever time of the day for the rest of you. This has been a wonderful meeting with a tremendous amount of interesting insights. Let me just emphasize that we're going to look a little bit at the local. But in order to look at the local, you can't lose sight of the global, the national, and the regional. But I don't want to spend too much time on that. What I want to say is that we need to start to rebalance government and spending and action and focus of attention onto the local, which has been, in my view, grossly misunderstood and grossly mistreated in the context of the transformation to sustainability. Francis, you ask whether there's anything called a vaccine for the climate change, the existential threat, and the only vaccine is sustainability. And I would wonder whether you guys in BC might be thinking of what the Welsh did, and that is pass a piece of legislation called the Wellbeing and Future Generations Act, which gives a guarantee that every piece of activity, public, private, or voluntary, has to take into account the well-being of the next generation, as well as the well-being of the current generation. But particularly, and this is the theme of sustainability, that you cannot place the future generations in such a way they cannot live sustainably, because they are not in a position to be able to get out of the pickle we put them in. And these three young women who came earlier this evening have been exactly what we wanted to hear, and they've been a tonic to all of us. Let me very quickly summarize, Francis. I know you've got very little time. Why is the local important? Number one, it gives a sense of identity. It gives you a sense of place. It gives you a sense of purpose. It gives you a neighborhood and a community around which you can feel you can have a collective action. Number two, it gives you a very strong sense of citizenship. If you step out of line in a community, people will admonish you and notice that you are not doing what is the right thing for the next generation as well as for themselves. But if you do something worthwhile, cut your driving, change your diet, do the things to your house which remove the wastage of energy, or above all, go to green energy, then you'll be approved of. And that pride in living with each other and sharing the same common goal is a very important feature of sustainability and localism. The third point is also to pay tribute to my wonderful sister-in-law, Gail, who in my view was one of the few people I know who married localism to the cosmos, who understood that localism isn't just a pinprick, a bunch of daisy heads on a massive lawn full of daisies. It is actually the unity of time and space right across the cosmos. And there's no limitation to how we define time or space if we are completely connected to the totality of the cosmos. And that gives localism a great energy, because we are contributing to the well-being of the whole of the phenomenon of life, energy, and existence. So my conclusion, Francis, and for all of you, is that localism is the universe. It's universal. And the wonderful introduction you gave with your wonderful photographs at the beginning show us how we can explore that spirituality in our hearts and in our souls, and then become local with a real purpose.
Thank you, Tim. I mean, people have been through some pretty horrific times in history and managed to survive even in the darkest of times. So we must remain positive. We have much to look forward to. And I want to thank you all for another stimulating and engaging program. And I'm going to ask John, if you could please tell us about our final guest for today before we take a break from our webinars until Wednesday, January 13th, 2021.
Thank you, Francis. It's a great pleasure that I introduce my nephew, Evan Hesketh, to play a viola solo and cheer us on our way as we go through the end of season 2 and start on season 3. Evan studied viola at the University of Victoria and then got a master's degree in viola performance at the Cleveland Institute of Music. He is now teaching violin and viola in the Los Angeles area. So he's going to play a suite from Bach's unaccompanied group of suites for cello, but it's been transcribed for viola. So here is my nephew, Evan Hesketh.
Happy everything, everyone. See you in the new year. Thank you for tuning in. Bye for now.